Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was the owner of a cafe diner. Even the gods and goddesses of Olympus needed a day off. Sometimes they needed time away from the constant bickering and never-ending controversies of their family. On one such day, Wisdom and Moon found themselves discovering a hidden gem within the city that never sleeps, and meeting a familiar blonde knucklehead with a penchant for the color orange. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 17, Part 17. Must stay awake, Zeus told himself, leaning against the back of his throne as he half listened to Athena. Said goddess was on her feet, dressed in a traditional Greek chiton that was once all the Phocian back in ancient times, a long scroll in her hands that reached all the way to the floor. He loves his daughter, but she tended to take charge during solstice meetings and took it upon herself to air her grievances and list every tiny detail that was rattling around in her endless mind. The first couple of times it was cute, but now, millennia later, it was little more than exhausting to hear. Hence why he often left Athena's speech to last. Blue eyes drifting away from the goddess of wisdom, the whole room looked to be in the same state to himself, though some hid it better than others. Apollo and Hermes' posture was similar to his own, though at some point they sank further into their thrones with their legs spread out in front of them and shoulders dropping to the height of the armrests. Hermes even had the nerve to let out a yawn, briefly making his elder sister stop mid-sentence and direct a glare his way before continuing. Since she didn't summon her spear, he had to imagine she was close to finishing. His other sons weren't much better than the pair. Dionysus was already asleep and had been for some time. Maybe an hour, but that was nothing new. The youngest of his Olympian brood couldn't go an hour into the solstice meetings before falling asleep, which was why he had him as one of the first to speak on current affairs related to him. The god of wine was dressed still in his camp attire and clearly looked unhappy with the situation. Not that Zeus cared. His son had brought it upon himself. If he wanted someone to blame, all he needed to do was look in the mirror. Near to Dionysus was Hephaestus, who now and again would look Athena's way to appear like he was paying attention. In reality, the god of the forge was tinkering away with some device, trying to hide it from his sister. Rubbing his face, his son was none the wiser to the oil smears across his face, flecks of metal glittering in his long and shaggy beard. Then again, maybe he did know but didn't care. The latter was most likely the case. Though, he would sneak glances at the goddess of love, who sat further down the line of thrones. Unsurprisingly, Aphrodite was paying no attention to Athena's speech, though, unlike her ex-husband, she didn't try to hide it. Sporting long blonde hair that ran down her back like a golden waterfall, the goddess of love decided it was a good time to paint her toenails. A small tube of hot pink nail polish sat perfectly on the edge of the armrest, her petite feet resting on the edge of her throne. A rare look of concentration was on her face as she ran the brush over the nails, giving Athena a deadpan expression when she felt the younger goddess's eyes on her. She even brushed off the glare Artemis was sending her way. Speaking of his daughter, Artemis was one of the few in the room who remained upright and appeared to be paying attention to her sister's speech. Like her sister, Artemis was dressed in a chiton like the old days, though silver, instead of white. Her bow rested on the side of her throne along with her quiver of arrows at the ready. Sitting in her hand was a small knife, which she spun between her fingers. The glare she was sending towards the goddess of love and the look of defiance she got back made her toy with the weapon dangerously. Those two truly are each other's worst enemies, Zeus thought. He'd all but forbade them from getting in a fight with one another during the solstices. Despite Artemis being the superior fighter, Aphrodite was scrappy. She wasn't against using underhanded tactics to get the better of the moon goddess. The last time the pair got into a serious physical altercation, they broke San Francisco. The two were on thin ice for over a decade and weren't allowed back to the city ever. The rest of the gods in the throne room of Olympus weren't much better. Ares was staring up at the ceiling while one of his many knives, toying with it in his meaty hands. His eldest son and the god of war was as uninterested in the meeting as always. If the atmosphere was calm, he'd be the one to instigate a battle just for the hell of it. On more than one occasion walked in to find Ares trapping one of his brothers in a headlock or full Nelson. Everyone knew it was Ares teaching Aphrodite holds to put Artemis in on the occasions they fought. He couldn't stop himself from shaking his head. Of all his children, Ares was the one that disappointed him the most. He and Hera spoiled their firstborn. What a mistake that had been. If they'd been firmer with him, maybe he would have turned out different. The last two of the Olympian pantheon, Hera and Demeter, sat beside one another, making idle chat as they waited for the meeting to end. Unlike his wife, whose dark hair tied into a neat braid down one side of her body, Demeter wore her long golden hair unimpeded. It flowed like a golden waterfall with straw and wheat woven in certain places. Her chiton, while conservative, was a light green color, showing enough skin to leave most men fawning over her. Demeter looks very beautiful today, he thought to himself, until quickly shaking those thoughts out of his head a moment later. He and Demeter had a long history with one another, given Persephone was their firstborn child to both of them. For the most part, they were on good terms, but now and again, when autumn and winter set in and Persephone set off for the underworld, things got chilly between them. The king always felt it was best to give his older sister her space during those months, letting her fawn over her other immortal children as a distraction from her favorite. Speaking of his siblings, a yawn came from his right and spared a glance at his elder brother, the god of the sea. Like the rest of the gods, Poseidon had one hand resting against his face as he willed himself to stay awake. As always, he was wearing those ridiculous Hawaiian shirts he loved, along with a pair of flip-flops. The contrast in style between them couldn't be more different. Everything Zeus wore was stylish and smart and spoke volumes on where he was on the leadership hierarchy. Poseidon, meanwhile, looked like a beach bum who forgot to shave and spent his day fishing at the harbor. "Stop staring at me," Poseidon's voice muttered. Zeus noticed the sea-green eyes of his brother looking at him from the corner. "Stop yawning. Athena won't be much longer. Tell that to the rest of your brood. Most of the room looks half asleep already." Zeus grumbled but couldn't fault his brother's words. Sitting upon his throne and straightening his back, the god of the sky let out a mighty clap as he brought his two hands together. For a split second, the room flashed with light as lightning danced across the sky around Olympus, and thunder boomed in their eardrums. The effect it had was instant. Apollo and Hermes both jumped in their thrones. Dionysus slid off his throne in surprise. Hera and Demeter's chat came to an end. Ares dropped his knife, nearly landing and piercing through his thigh. Hephaestus dropped his doohickey and grumbled to himself. Aphrodite missed her foot completely, smearing pink nail polish across her skin. Even Athena and Artemis were caught by surprise, with Athena fumbling her notes in her hands and Artemis' bow clattering to the ground. The only one who wasn't surprised was Poseidon, who merely rolled his eyes and sank further into his throne. "Need I remind you all, this is the summer solstice. I expect you all to pay attention when a member of this council is speaking." He narrowed his eyes predominantly over his children and Aphrodite, all of whom had the decency to gulp and make themselves look presentable. He turned and looked at Athena, who nodded to her. "Continue with your report, Athena." A small smile wove onto Athena's face. "Thank you, Father. However, I have just finished." The papers in her hands disappeared in a flash of golden light, teleporting back to her temple. Falling back on her throne, she smoothed down the front of her chiton and crossed her sandal-clad ankles over each other. She turned and glared at her brothers, having tried to ignore their lack of respect moments earlier. "Your attention spans need work. Falling asleep in the middle of a council meeting is deplorable." "You say that like you haven't done it," Hermes muttered, earning another glare from his older sister. "I haven't." The god of the sun looked to his sister. "You never get on Uncle P's case. He's just as bad." "Don't drag me into this, Apollo," Poseidon scolded. The last thing the elder god wanted was getting dragged into his niece and nephew's war of words. Athena could grate on his nerves daily if he hadn't grown a tolerance to her barbed tongue. Ignoring her when she got high and mighty was the best option for his eternal sanity. Athena turned to her uncle, her gray eyes shining. "I don't get on his case, Apollo, because I know a lost cause when I see one." Tilting his head in her direction, the god of the sea leveled his niece with a glare. She could be as annoying as his brother. Worse even, once she got going. Centuries ago, he would snipe back at her, and the two would have fallen into another pointless argument. Now, he settled for scratching his eye with his middle finger, in full view for Athena to see. Watching her face scrunch up in annoyance was enough to make him half grin before turning away. All Zeus could do was sigh. "I guess that's it for another year," Hera announced, standing up from her throne and rubbing her shoulders. "Let's call it a day." "I'm good with that." "Same." "Finally. I thought that was never going to end." One by one, his family got up from their thrones and began making their way towards the large set of golden doors. They formed small groups, with Athena and Artemis pairing together, while Hera and Demeter did the same. Aphrodite was whisking Ares away, whispering something in his ears that made the god of war grin like a maniac. Hephaestus trailed behind them, annoyance on his face, while Dionysus slinked away, knowing full well his destination was back to Camp Half-Blood. The only one who didn't move was Poseidon, who looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "You've got that look on your face. What more is there?" Again, the god of the sky let out a loud sigh. Moments later, he clapped his hand again to gain their attention. Lightning dancing across the sky with the sound of thunder booming into their ears. The action was enough for everyone to freeze their advancements and turn back to their king. "We're not finished yet," Zeus announced, giving them all a poignant look. "Take your seats." A loud groan came from his sons, with Hermes voicing his annoyance. "Come on, Dad. Is it really that important? Can't it wait?" "No, it can't." "But surely dash." Hermes didn't get to finish as lightning raced across the sky again and fell silent under Zeus's intense gaze. One by one, the Olympians on their feet dragged themselves back to their thrones, some of them flopping down with clear annoyance on their face. "What this all about, Zeus?" he heard Hera ask as his wife returned to her throne next to him. A delicate eyebrow was raised, with her intense brown eyes looking into his blue ones. "You did not mention anything about another announcement this morning at breakfast." The summer solstice was an all-afternoon affair. "You'll understand why in a moment," he thought, before beginning to speak. "It has come to my attention that in recent months, many of you have been frequenting a small cafe in the West Village, known as the Fox's Denmark." Everyone in the room who's visited the establishment perked up, notably Athena and Artemis. Their curiosity instantly intensified, wondering what in the world their favorite spot in the city had to do with their meeting. "What about it?" Apollo asked, looking confused. "Are we all going there after this meeting?" "'Cause, I'd be cool with that." "Same here." Hermes pipped up, as did a few of the others in the room. "No, Apollo. We are not going to the Fox's Den after the summer solstice meeting. In fact, none of you will be returning to that place ever again," he announced, and watched as over half of the eyes in the room suddenly widened. "As of today, the Fox's Den in the West Village of New York City is off limits to Olympus." The room went silent for a brief of moments before a group of them jumped from their thrones in disbelief. "What? You can't do that. That's not fair. My D&D group were planning another game day in 2 weeks. Where am I supposed to stop for coffee in the early hours of mornings on my delivery runs? How am I supposed to wrap these legs around that hunk of body of his?" Zeus groaned and tried to ignore the voice of Aphrodite, who was describing all the things she planned to do to the blonde. The goddess of love was none the wiser to the annoyed expression of Ares's face or the rolling of the eyes coming from her former husband. Apollo and Hermes were yammering on endlessly, but when he looked at Artemis, he found the goddess of the moon was seething. Her face was flushing gold as the itcher rushed to her head from how angry she was. He knew she would be angry, but he'd never felt his youngest Olympian daughter glare at him with such anger before. The only one who wasn't speaking was Athena. Her gray eyes were speaking enough by the way she was gazing at him. "Gods, this is troublesome. Husband, this is a most peculiar decree. Weren't we meant to visit this place next week?" Hera asked, confusion written all over her face. The goddess of marriage had been looking forward to visiting the little cafe ever since word of mouth started reaching her ears. She finally found room in her busy schedule to make a lunch date for the two of them. "Persephone and I were planning on going tomorrow. You've dashed our plans." Demeter chimed in, "My little flower was looking forward to visiting. What am I supposed to tell her now?" "Not that I'm bothered by the announcement," Poseidon started, "but is there a particular reason? It's a bit strange to bar us from going to a cafe." "Granted, his brother could make the oddest laws and forbid them from doing some of the weirdest things, but this was a little strange even for him. The god of the sky grumbled, "My daughter, Thalia, has fallen under his care. Until she is ready to attend Camp Half-Blood, she will remain with him. Therefore, I'm barring this pantheon from having any communication with either of them." Silence quickly fell through the throne room, and unconsciously, all the eyes in the room drifted to the queen. Whatever expression she held a moment ago instantly vanished. A look so frosty and cold the oceans would have become a frozen wasteland was evident to everyone. Even Poseidon had the good decency to know it wasn't a good idea to poke the bear when she was angry. "Father, you can't be serious!" Artemis yelled, breaking the silence and continuing to glare at her father. "Your demigods are powerful. A demigod with such a potent scent with a mortal with no training? Monsters will come for them constantly. It's a death sentence." "I have to agree with Artemis." Athena finally spoke, "To place young Thalia with Naruto Uzumaki is foolish. Not to mention dangerous for both of the individuals. They're more at risk than ever before. It would make more sense to send Thalia straight to the camp." Hermes frowned, "Thor is a little young, don't you think? There have been younger. It's a sad truth, but sometimes it's for the best. In this case, Thalia should go to the camp. Chiron would watch over her, as would Dionysus." Athena turned and looked at her youngest Olympian brother, who again slipped asleep, losing interest in the conversation at hand. "Well, maybe just Chiron. This matter is not up for discussion," Zeus declared, standing up from his throne and looking out across the room. "If it makes you feel any better, no, I have charged Hestia with keeping an eye on them both. She is well acquainted with the owner and kind enough to watch over them." "Our sister is acquainted with a mortal man?" Poseidon asked, looking confused. He wasn't aware his sister had friends outside of their family circle. "Yes, they have been well," Zeus scrunched up his face, "friends, for many millennia apparently." Artemis and Athena looked ready to retort, but the words died in their mouth as Zeus's words sunk in. Similar looks wove onto the faces of the rest of the council. "Millennia? What?" Aphrodite asked, wondering if Zeus misspoke. The king smoothed down his jacket and tie. "What do you mean they've known each other for millennia? He's what? 25? 30 at a push?" She looked over at Athena and Artemis for confirmation, but the two goddesses were frowning too. They didn't know either. The topic of his age surprisingly never came up in their conversations. They always assumed he was no older than 30, given his appearance. Hermes and Apollo were shrugging too. They had no idea. Zeus ran a hand through his beard as he looked at the stumped expressions of his children. "Naruto Uzumaki is not mortal. He's a relic from before Olympus. The last golden man left in existence. He's immortal," he announced and watched the looks of disbelief run across the faces of his family. Even Hera momentarily dropped her frosty expression, glancing at her husband in wonder as she took in the information. His most intelligent child looked as if her brain was about to go into overload. "You can't be serious." Poseidon replied, his tone of voice more serious. "A golden man? Surely, you jest." "I'm not. Hestia was with me, and she confirmed everything he told us was true. Hades was there too, as was Melano." "Why were they there?" "Apparently, Melano discovered information about him before that day and informed her father. They turned up when we did, so they were part of the conversation." Zeus revealed, calling out back to the conversation. "Hades was unsettled by the revelation as I was, and commissioned Melano to watch over him as Hestia does. So that's why he was there," Hera muttered, not forgetting about the little insult her older brother threw her way that afternoon. Grumbling to herself, she was still trying to think of a way to get back at the walking corpse she called a sibling. The gloomy idiot ruined her day. There was also the fact that Zeus's illegitimate spawn was now living in New York for the foreseeable future. At least, with the girl in California, she was far from Olympus. Now, she was on their doorstep. It was less than ideal. "Hold on. Let's rewind," Artemis announced, still trying to absorb the information and process it accordingly, though appeared to handle it better than her older sister. "Are you telling me Naruto isn't a mortal who makes delicious baked goods?" Everyone gave her a flat expression, but an immortal who comes from an era that predates us. Yes, that's right. And Aunt Hestia has known about it all along. Again, yes. According to Hestia, the two are, Zeus looked pained to say the next word, besties. Poseidon didn't look pleased by the news either, a frown settling in on his face. The following noise to come out from his daughter was a growl, fists tight at her side. A moment later, she scrunched her face up, and spun around and started marching out of the throne room, picking up her bow sitting next to her throne. Each step was very dramatic, like a child who didn't like being told off. Artemis, where are you going? To beat up that jerk, and tie my bow around his damn neck. Zeus rolled his eyes at his daughter's declaration. Return to your throne, Artemis. It took a minute of coaxing, but the moon goddess returned to her seat, her expression locked into one of anger. The image of his daughter wrapping her bow around the blonde's neck was very appealing. Everyone appeared to be trying to find words, but so many of them couldn't find the right ones. It was a rather big bombshell to drop. The only one who hadn't spoken was Athena, whose thoughts must have been a jumbled mess in that head of hers. Are you all right, Athena? Artemis was the one who spoke and leaned over her throne to tap on her shoulder sister's arm. The goddess of wisdom didn't react. Instead, she just continued to stare at the floor, worrying her father and amusing other members of the family. I think you broke her, Dad. Apollo joked as a camera flash went off across the throne room. The god of war grinned before handing over a camera to the love goddess, Dite. I've never seen her look speechless before. I want to savor the moment. She turned and winked at Ares. Thanks, honey. You get a special treat later. One of her hands reached up and patted his cheek. Looking pleased with himself, the god of war's eyes lit up into tiny balls of fire, similar to those of his aunts. Anytime, babe. Swoosh. Ow. Aphrodite held her hand between her knees, tiny droplets of golden ichor spilling onto the floor alongside the destroyed camera. A hiss escaped her lips, feeling the cut now running across the side of her hand. She glared over at the goddess who fired the arrow. What was the for? Leave her alone. I won't let you make a fool out of Athena. Can't you see she's trying to collect her thoughts? Artemis defended. That's exactly why I wanted a photo. I want to remember that expression of hers. Do you want me to rearrange your face? 'Cause I'll happily oblige. Zeus ran a hand over his face as the two troublesome deities got into another one of their arguments. Granted, he wouldn't fault Artemis for stepping in to defend her clearly dazed sister, but he didn't need them getting into another fight. Speaking of Athena, it was tough to imagine what was happening in her mind. He was well aware of how much she loved going to that little cafe. Her smile was present more often after returning from a trip there. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, Athena had developed a soft spot for the immortal who owned it, as did Artemis. Betrayal was likely on her mind, having been duped by the man all this time about his true origins. He heard Poseidon shuffle around on his throne, turning to look at his brother. Are you sure leaving your daughter with someone like that is a good idea? He asked quietly. I don't know much about the race of men created by our grandmother, but I know they were stronger than all the other generations. Not really, but I trust our sister's judgment. Zeus didn't like it, but Hestia had convinced him the best place for Thalia was with Naruto. He's strong. Strong enough to keep Hades and me from coming to blows. I don't know the full extent of his powers, and I don't know if I want to know. I have a feeling he might be a thorn in our side. What form that will take, only time will tell. Do you really think your children are going to listen? The idea of Zeus's children following the new decree was laughable. Each one of them inherited his stubbornness and pig-headedness. A snort broke from Zeus. What do you think? I have no doubt they will find a way to go back there. Hopefully, Thalia will have a couple of years of normalcy before that happens. I trust something will divert their attention for a while. Hopefully, some normalcy for once will befall Olympus. The god of the sea felt his brother was being optimistic. There's no such thing as normal when it comes to this family. Preaching to the choir there, brother. Zeus reiterated before a commotion broke out in front of him. Artemis. Get off, Aphrodite. Our bodies are not supposed to bend that way. 6 months later. Thank you, "And have a Merry Christmas," Naruto said as he watched a pair of customers exit the Fox's Den and return to the cold New York streets. It was safe to say December had thus far been his busiest month as he approached the first anniversary of opening his cafe. There was something about the holiday of Christmas that made people crave warmth and delicious baked goods. Dressed in a festive Christmas jumper and wearing a Santa hat that covered most of his blonde hair, he'd freely admit he was getting into the spirit of the holiday this year. In the past, he treated Christmas like any ordinary day. It was a day for spending with your family and loved ones and spreading joy. All it did was serve as a reminder of what he didn't have anymore. However, this year it wasn't an option for him to wallow in his own self-pity with a very excited little girl now living with him. It was safe to say the daughter of Zeus was beyond excited for Christmas. With Hestia's help and guidance, the pair decorated his home into a Christmas haven with a big tree standing tall in his living room. "Uncle! Uncle!" He heard and turned to smile at Thalia, who dashed over and jumped in the air, only for the blonde to catch her mid-jump. The dark-haired girl giggled as he bounced her in his arms. "How much longer until we can go home?" "Not long, Thalia," he replied, smiling at being referred to as uncle. "You and Aunt Hestia are heading home first, and I'll be home in another hour. I have to tidy up." "Ah. Can't Mel do it?" "You always have to do it," she asked, a pouty expression on her face. "Now, I wouldn't be a good boss if I left it for Melino to do alone, would I?" With that said, the door to the kitchen pushed open and out walked the goddess of ghosts, dressed in mortal clothing and a bright Christmas jumper on her person. It had taken about 2 weeks and a lot of prodding by Hestia before finally caving in. The daughter of Hades wasn't the jolliest of people, preferring to wear only the color black. He watched as said goddess walked to her customer's table and placed 2 small wrapped boxes next to an elderly couple. Both contained mince pies, though one was traditional, and the other was a pineapple and rum variation he concocted. "Here are your orders. Have a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in the new year," she said in a sickly sweet voice that was slowly decaying her insides for even performing. The young goddess was very rough around the edges during her first month, and more often than not, Naruto would find customers sprinting out of the Fox's Den for fear of their lives. It took some time and training on appropriate customer service until he was confident he'd drilled the do's and don'ts into her skull. Once the customers were out of the building, her gloomy expression returned. "Thank my father that's over with," she muttered and turned to look at her employer and his charge. "Please tell me it's almost over. 10 more minutes, and that's it. Thank the gods for that." "Uncle, why is Mel always grumpy?" Thalia asked, turning to look up at the blonde. "That's a good question, Thalia," he replied, looking at the little girl in amusement. "I don't think she gets enough sleep. She stays up long past her bedtime and listens to music that's too loud. There is nothing wrong with my choice of music. It's not my fault you and Aunt Hestia only listen to oldies. Who listens to Chubby Checker these days?" Across the years, as music evolved, the best friends had enlightened themselves with music from each generation. From Chubby Checker to the Supremes. From Elvis Presley to David Bowie. From The Who to Aretha Franklin. If there was one thing the pair could praise Apollo for, it was the evolution of sound over the recent century. There was nothing like it back in Naruto's time in Konoha. Nothing close. On Friday evenings after the den was closed, the immortal shinobi and the goddess of the hearth would find themselves in his living room with a bottle of wine and music from all decades playing. Sometimes Thalia was fast asleep, and other times the daughter of Zeus was shaking her little booty alongside the two. The other night, Hestia showed her niece how to do the twist, Motorhead, and Black Sabbath. Now that's music. It's rude to question someone else's taste in music with such negativity, Melino. The younger goddess nearly jumped in the air before turning to find Hestia staring at her from a couple of feet away. Her ever-present smile was on her face, which only served to frighten Melino more. She dressed in winter gear, with a long coat with a fluffy hood. It was a light pink, which Aphrodite would have approved. A bag of presents was in her hand, all of which had Thalia's name written all over them. Tomorrow was the 21st of December. That meant it was almost time for the winter solstice. Such an important event meant little to Naruto and even Hestia, who saw it as little more as a meeting for her siblings to bicker amongst each other. In particular, Hades would be visiting, which meant there would be a small queue of people looking to pick a fight with the god of the underworld. She would put in her time there to play peacekeeper between her family as she always did, but this year, she was more invested in the 22nd. The day after the winter solstice happened to be Thalia's birthday, and Hestia had already retrieved the little girl's birthday presents, as well as Christmas presents. The whole week, the daughter of Zeus was going to be spoiled rotten. Together, Naruto and herself were working on her birthday cake. All 5 layers of it. It might have looked over the top, but it was a memorable birthday. Even Zeus, who'd been kept on a very tight leash by Hera since the summer solstice, managed to subtly give her a present to give to his daughter, without the other gods noticing. She said he was welcome to join them, but the king declined the offer. If the other gods caught him breaking the rules, he'd never hear the end of it. Just because we don't share the same taste in music doesn't make that a bad thing. It's good to have variety. I know. I completely agree. She waved her hands in the air to reason with the older deity. Behind her, Naruto and Thalia looked at each other before the dark-haired demigod started giggling. She jumped down from the blonde's arms and grabbed Melino's free hand. It's okay, Mel. I know Auntie Hestia can be scary sometimes, but Uncle says she's a big softie at heart. He says she's like a big bowl of pudding. A nervous chuckle escaped Naruto's lip, feeling the eyes of the goddess turn in his direction. A big bowl of pudding, am I? Her eerie smile strengthened. I'll try to remember that piece of information the next time I decide to make us a family dinner. Maybe I'll throw in some spice for next time. A real fire breather. It was a jest, that's all. Thalia knows I was only kidding. The daughter of Zeus shook her head, Then Uncle said that when Auntie gets mad, make her some tea, and she calms down. Did he now? The blonde grumbled and shot the little girl a dirty look. All he received was a big smile in return. You're lucky you're adorable. He muttered and ruffled the girl's hair. Anyway. Are you girls heading home? Both looked dressed to leave, with the goddess eyeing the weather conditions. We are. I assume we can expect you home in an hour. She crouched down and pulled up the zip on Thalia's coat. She didn't want her knees to get cold. Then, much to the daughter of Zeus's displeasure, grabbed a woolly pink hat from her pocket, neatly putting it on her head. It wasn't so much the hat that bothered the girl, but the color. Pink was a no-no color, but Thalia would have to endure it for now. Yeah, that's the plan. The blonde shinobi rubbed the back of his neck. 2 more days before he would be closing his doors for the remainder of the holidays. The Fox's Den wouldn't be reopening until the January 2nd, leaving him with time to spend with Hestia and Thalia. He was sorely looking forward to the time off. All right. Don't push yourself too hard. Hestia told him. He worked far too hard, in her opinion, and didn't take enough time to himself. She took her niece's hand. Come on, sweetie. Let's get your backpack from the office, and we'll head home. Okay. Chuckling at Thalia's eagerness as the pair walked to the back, Naruto turned his attention to the room. There weren't too many people left, most having left over an hour ago. It was doubtful he'd get any more customers. Most people wanted to be with their families since it was so close to Christmas, and he couldn't fault them. Scanning the people, he turned his attention to the young woman sitting at the back of the room with his back to him. If he remembered right, she ordered a oolong tea and a small piece of carrot cake. That was 30 minutes again. Straightening his shirt, he walked over to find the woman looking out the window with her chin resting in her palm. After almost half a minute passed, Naruto let out a short cough to get her attention. The reaction was instant, and the woman jolted awake and turned to look at him. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say something? She asked, an embarrassed expression appearing. My head was elsewhere. Naruto smiled. I just wanted to check if you wanted anything else. I think you finished your tea a little while ago. Would you like a top-up? The woman looked down into her mug. No. I'm okay, thanks. The woman started to say. Naruto watched as she turned her attention outside and noticed her staring at another woman walking along the pavement, a young girl no older than Thalia holding her hand. Both looked happy, with bags likely filled with presents in the woman's other hand. A sigh escaped her mouth, and her fingers tightened around the handle on the mug. Naruto didn't need to be telepathic to know something was on her mind. Something on your mind, I take it. She nodded, something like that. It's kinda hard to explain. She told him, actually, wait. It's not hard to explain. It's just something I wasn't expecting. The blonde shinobi frowned, tilting his head. She started as if trying to find the words, I hadn't been feeling too good these last few days. I thought it was just a bug, but it turns out it was morning sickness. I'm pregnant. Oh. Congratulations. He replied and noticed her uneasy expression, that's good, right? She didn't look too sure. The woman looked down at her mug, I think so, she said, before looking unsure again, I don't know. Having a baby is supposed to be a joyous moment, you know? It's meant to be one of the biggest moments in a woman's life. She shook her head, causing her dark brown hair to wave across her face, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be saying all this to someone I don't know. Naruto waved his hands in front of him, don't worry. It's good to vent. Keeping it all locked in usually doesn't end well. He held out his hand to the woman, I'm Naruto. I'm the owner of the Fox's Denmark. The woman eyed him for a moment before tentatively shaking his hand, Sally. She replied and eyed him curiously, I've never met a Naruto before. I'd be surprised if you did. It's not a name you find on this corner of the world. He admitted, before turning back to the previous subject, so, I guess your pregnancy wasn't planned. Sally's hand returned to her mug, not at all. I always knew I wanted children, but I didn't think I'd be starting so young. I only turned 22 a month ago. Coincidentally, that's when I met him. The father? He asked, with Sally nodding, have you told him? No, though I'm sure he already knows. Sally got a faraway look in her eyes, not that I'll ever see him again. She looked back at the blonde, our time together was a bit of a whirlwind. Where is he now? Somewhere at sea, I imagine, Sally muttered, her eyes becoming half-lidded, lost in a wave of memories as she remembered her whirlwind time with the father of her unborn child. Naruto went to open his mouth, but her words lingered in his mind. His eyes traveled down to her stomach, where one of her hands rested, gently stroking her currently flat belly. Why did this scenario sound so familiar? A young and beautiful mortal woman. A whirlwind romance. Unplanned pregnancy. Father nowhere in sight. Yep. Definitely familiar. And she said somewhere at sea. He thought, before letting out a low groan, one hand rising to massage his forehead. As much as it could have been a coincidence, the blonde shinobi doubted it. This guy you had a whirlwind romance with? He asked, watching Sally turn her attention back to him, black hair? Tanned? Neatly trimmed beard and looks like he lifted weights all his life? Has an unhealthy obsession with Hawaiian shirts. If he had any talent in painting, the picture of Sally would be similar to the scream. Her jaw dropped so low it was a surprise he didn't have to pick it up from the floor. You know Po Dash. Never met him, but I've met his brothers. The elder, and the younger one. He revealed, running a hand through his blonde hair, my best friend also happens to be his sister, who is currently walking into the room right now. A moment later, Hestia, along with Thalia at her side, appeared through the kitchen door, and he wasted no time in ushering them over. If possible, Sally went as pale as a person could go, her face a mask of disbelief and shock as she watched arguably the most beautiful woman she'd ever seen approach their table. Hestia didn't say anything, but as she drew closer, Naruto watched as her attention shifted from him to the young mortal woman on the other side of the table. Her eyes, usually calm and serene, became distant as they trailed down Sally's body until resting on her stomach. Sally didn't move, nor did she react as Hestia's free hand moved forward and hovered over her womb. A shroud of warmth blanketed over her body and watched with nerves of steel as the goddess's eyes grew brighter. Sally, meet Hestia, Naruto muttered, though he had a feeling the young woman was putting the deity's identity together already. It was a wonder just how much she already knew. The goddess of the hearth just stood there for a few moments before retracting her hand. Hestia. Hestia took a calming breath. That idiot is in so much trouble when I get my hands on him. Yikes. I would not like to Poseidon right now. He didn't want to think what the woman would do to her brother once she got a hold of him. Pinching the bridge of his nose, he let out a low sigh and leaned back in his chair. What was it with this family and their problems ending up on his doorstep? Well, so much for peace and quiet in the foreseeable future. Chapter 18, Part 18. I'm sorry for the long wait, everyone. After I posted the last chapter, I had about 1,000 words written up before suddenly hitting a case of writer's block. Unfortunately, the words just weren't coming. I've been working on few other little projects here and there, so be on the lookout for those. Finally, a few weeks ago I got over the wall and have steadily been adding to it. Anyway, it's long overdue, but please enjoy Part XVLLL. 4 years later. Are you sure this doesn't feel too small? Naruto asked, leaning against the glass cabinet and holding a slim black book in his hands. He toyed around with it, running his fingers across the smooth leather, feeling the tiny indentations in the material with the tips. Was the old menu really too big for the customers? I thought people like variety. Behind him, the goddess of the hearth gracefully moved between the tables where customers were enjoying their drinks and snacks. A tray rested between her left arm and her side, coming to lean against the side of the counter with him. Dressed in clothes similar to Naruto's, a white dress shirt with an orange apron tied across the front, the deity had made some not-so-subtle touches in the past couple of years to the fox's den. Truthfully, he was beginning to wonder if it was such a good idea to let her work here. Not that he'd ever say that to her. Naruto, we've been over this. I know, but still, the blonde started, looking back and forth between Hestia and the new menu. I liked the old menu. There was nothing wrong with it. An exasperated sigh left the goddess's lips. The menu was growing out of control. You kept adding too much into it, and you weren't taking anything out in return. The old menu, while nice, had grown to the point where Hestia had to put her foot down. When she started working at the Fox's Den, she originally agreed she wouldn't micromanage the cafe. Admittedly, she did point out a few areas where the Fox's Den could improve, and the small changes she made had been for the better. Naruto was happy to work alongside his best friend, but there was a line in the sand. The condition of the menu proved how stubborn both parties could be when they disagreed on something. Hestia wanted to downsize the menu, and Naruto felt it was fine as it was. Inevitably, Hestia's persistence defeated Naruto's stubbornness, and the blonde conceded to make some changes to the menu. Now half the size, the new menu was much more customer-friendly and didn't leave customers at a loss of what to order from having too many choices. They kept the special of the day, of which Naruto and Hestia would take turns in choosing and making. More often than not, the pair would find themselves competing with each other, keeping track of how many were bought and eaten by customers and comparing who got more by the end of the week. They would tally up the result on Sunday, the one day a week the Fox's Den wasn't opened, and the loser would have to cook Sunday dinner. Yeah, I guess I did. He admitted. Melano, was the menu too big? Yes, the goddess of ghosts was still working as a waitress for Naruto, though she wasn't showing open disdain for the job, nor was she scaring customers away. At least, not as often. Melano had fallen into the role as a waitress rather well in the last 4 years, and despite Naruto and Hestia telling her she didn't have to keep working there, the younger goddess continued to appear. Hades had confided in his sister 2 years after finding out about the blonde he'd dismissed his daughter from keeping watch over him months earlier. She didn't need to be there, but it appeared the reclusive daughter of the underworld enjoyed being in their company. Not that she would ever admit it out loud. The old menu was big enough to be a life raft for someone lost at sea. She replied, appearing amused as the blonde's shoulders dropped. The new one is far superior. Much more classy while remaining affordable to the masses. The customers like it more too. No one wants to read a menu the size of a novel. A triumphant look washed over Hestia's face. Fine, fine. I concede. The new menu is better. That was hard for him to admit since he'd solely create the original, but he'd concede the new one made more sense than the previous, but no more changes, please. I like my little cafe just the way it is. Hestia giggled and pinched his cheek, only serving to get a pout from the blonde. All right, you big baby. No more changes. Thank you. The door to the front of the Fox's Den shimmered open, and Naruto was ready and waiting as someone barreled into him. His clone had dispersed a minute ago, alerting him to their arrival as he found the blue eyes of Thalia Grace looking up at him. "Hi, uncle." "Hello, Thalia," he said while patting the top of her head. "How was school?" The 9-year-old didn't answer immediately, first turning and embracing her aunt, whose arms were open and ready to wrap themselves around the form of her darling niece. The little girl that was abandoned at his doorstep so long ago had grown so much. "It was okay, I guess. I have to read chapter 4 of Matilda tonight and discuss it with the class tomorrow. Miss Carter said she'd be asking everyone in the class questions tomorrow, so she'll know if anyone hasn't read it. Then we'll go over it tonight before your bath." Hestia offered, happy her niece was informing them of the work set. At one point, Thalia had been hiding the fact homework was set for the class, mainly when focused on reading. It wasn't all surprising Thalia had an aversion to reading. Minds of the demigods that came from her pantheon were wired for Greek rather than English and caused a great deal of struggle for a demigod of Thalia's age. It took years of practice to get a grip on reading in the common tongue of the country. They spoke with Thalia privately in the space of their home and promised to help her with her homework, her reading in particular. "Okay," Thalia replied, shrugging her shoulder, though not appearing happy about it. There had been some tantrums in the past when it came to Thalia's reading, but the little girl knew she couldn't get away with anything when her aunt was around. A moment later, another pair of eyes were looking up at Naruto and Hestia. Instead of blue, they were tiny pools of sea green, reminiscent of the Mediterranean Sea. "Hi, uncle." Naruto smiled and picked up the small child before plopping him down on the counter. "Hello, Percy." The little boy then turned to his aunt. "Hi, auntie." A giggle escaped Hestia's lips as her hand smoothed down her nephew's jet-black hair. The son of her brother, Poseidon, looked very much like his godly parent. The same eyes, hair, and even his nose were the same. "Hello, Perseus. You two didn't leave your mom behind again, did you?" The door jingled, and a voice replied, "They did." Walking into the fox's den, Sally Jackson appeared, looking out of breath, likely trying to catch up with her 3-year-old son and his 8-year-old cousin. "Percy, what did I tell you about running off?" she asked, taking off her jacket to reveal a similar uniform to Hestia and pulled out a black scrunchie to tie back her hair. "Not to." "And what did you do?" "Run off." Percy tilted his head to one side, making him look cuter than he usually appeared. Sally's expression softened at the look, as did Hestia's, while Naruto patted his head. Naruto wasn't a betting man, but he had a feeling the young son of Poseidon was going to be a real heartbreaker when he was older. Sally sighed. "What am I to do with you?" she asked, softly running her fingers through her son's dark hair and kissing his forehead, much to his delight. "You're going to stay with Aunt Hestia and Thalia while Mommy works. Be good." "I will. I'll get my jacket, and then we'll be on our way." Hestia disappeared with the two demigods trailing close behind, with Percy quickly grabbing onto his older cousin's hand. The act was enough to make Naruto and Sally smile. The pair looked more like siblings than cousins. "You know, Melano and I can handle things today if you wanted an early night." "You looked tired, Sally." The brunette mortal waved off the worry. "I'm fine. I was up late trying to finish a report that's due this morning. It took longer than I thought it would." A lot had changed for Sally Jackson in 5 years, ever since that fateful meeting during the Christmas holidays. Finding out she was pregnant with the father absent from her life, a job that wouldn't support her financially with a new baby and no family to call on for help, she'd never felt more lost in her life. She'd wandered through New York aimlessly for what felt like hours before eventually ending up the fox's den. Unbeknownst to her, she'd wandered into the right place and met people that ultimately helped her get her life in order. Naruto had been, for the lack of a discretion, a guardian angel to her. She was never religious by nature, but a small part of her felt like some unknown power had guided her to his doorstep that day. He changed her life for the better. Through him, she met Hestia, Melano, and of course, Thalia. Said little girl had been a constant presence in her life as she grew heavy with her son and seemed to find some kind of fascination that a baby was growing in her tummy. Needless to say, some of the questions she ended up using left the blonde a spluttering mess and looked to Hestia to solve the issue. Sometimes the goddess of the hearth came to the rescue, while other times, enjoyed watching the blonde squirm under the gaze of the 5-year-old in her endless curiosity. They were with her every step of the way. They helped her get an apartment near where they lived in the West Village. They gave her a job and financial stability to support her and Percy once her son was born, and even helped her apply for courses at the local community college. When she was away studying for her business management course, either Hestia or Naruto would keep an eye on Percy for her. The blonde even went as far as to teach her some of his recipes, with the goddess occasionally adding her 2 cents in. She couldn't help but wonder how those two had stayed friends for so long. Sally was no expert, but she was sure she sensed chemistry there. Even Melino looked after the pair a few times, though often found her son and his cousin in very precarious situations. A few weeks ago, when she arrived to collect Percy from Naruto's home, she found her son being held by his ankles in the air by Thalia while his head was dunked in a fish tank, babbling nonsense to the goldfish. She almost had a heart attack, though her son's grinning face when he spotted her was enough to tell her he was fine. Naruto's hand rested on her shoulder and guided her to the kitchen. "Come on. Let's head to the back and see how well you remember the triple berry Nutella cupcakes recipes." On the building across from the fox's den, perched on the edge of the roof that looked down over the streets, 2 sets of eyes watched the interior with keen looks. One stared inquisitively, while the second looked longingly. 2 birds sat motionlessly, one a beautiful brown feathered owl, the other a hawk of similar coloring. "This is stupid. Why are we even here? This is towing the fine line father set up when he forbade us from visiting. SSSHHH. Stop talking, or we'll be spotted. I think we both know that's not going to happen. Unless mortals can climb up vertical surfaces like a spider monkey, I'd say we're safe." The gray eyes of the owl stared in the silver ones of the hawk, and if she didn't know any better, could have sworn a bead of drool was slipping through her beak. "You have a problem. You know that, right?" Inside the fox's den, they watched the blonde immortal walk across the interior and place down a small tray of cupcakes in front of the customer. Artemis let out a short gasp and a groan of longing. "Double chocolate peanut butter filled cupcakes. Oh, that mortal is so lucky. What I wouldn't give to be them right now." "Your stomach is truly made of celestial bronze," Athena replied. Although, deep down, she had to agree. They did like delicious. In the last 5 years, the goddess of wisdom would like to say she'd followed her father's commands to the letter and stayed far away from the fox's den, but that would be a lie. It took 6 months, impressive in her own mind for having the willpower to stay away before she inevitably found herself spying on the cafe and carefully watching the blonde owner. Naturally, she was full of questions. "We could sneak in, right? We would be caught the moment we walked through the door. And Hestia would recognize us immediately, as would Melino." Naruto, her gray eyes gazed back through the window and watched the blonde as he brought out another tray of yummy goodness. "Well, there's no telling what would happen, but I imagine he would know it was us too." A sigh escaped Artemis. "It's not fair. I might be angry at the blonde fool for lying to us, but I still miss the food. I overheard Aunt Hestia mention that they've created a new menu together. Could you imagine what those two have cooked up together?" Naruto and Hestia double teaming in the kitchen were enough to make Artemis go weak at the knees. There was no telling what kind of scrumptious goodies they were cooking up in the kitchen. Knowing she couldn't reach out and devour them was torture. "I'm still surprised Hestia went to work there. She's spent more time at the fox's den and Naruto's residence than she does on Olympus these days. Now that she doesn't need to hide her friendship within him, we hardly see her." All of the other gods on Olympus noticed the lack of the hearth deity. Zeus, in particular, would grumble about his beloved older sister spending time with that uncouth blonde in the mortal world. Honestly, who said uncouth anymore? Their father could get jealous easily, and seeing Hestia enjoying the company of someone that wasn't one of them felt otherworldly. He didn't like it but wouldn't voice it unless he wanted to earn his sister's ire. Poseidon, Hera, and Demeter were less put off by it, but still, the absence of the gods of the hearth had been felt by the siblings in particular than the rest. Only Hades didn't appear to be putting up a front about it. Then again, Artemis was sure Melino was transporting precious cargo back to the underworld for their uncle and occasionally Persephone when it was time for the goddess of spring to take to her second home. "I know. It's so unfair," Artemis whined, trying not to glare at the mortals leaving Fox's den with boxes of goodies secured comfortably in their grasp. Just imagining what might be in the box was enough to make Artemis's stomach growl. Before either could say another word and before Artemis could swoop down and steal the mortals' boxed baked goods from their hands, a shroud of warmth appeared from behind them. Athena and Artemis felt something warm grab them by the scruffs of the neck and hold them in the air, unfazed by their attempts to wriggle out of the grasp. They found the warm and curious eyes of their aunt staring at them, one eyebrow raised. A soft glow of fire illuminated around her body with two tendril-like arms sprouting from either side and responsible for grabbing the sisters and holding them in the air like grapes on a vine. "What are you two doing here?" Hestia asked, her voice calm, though with a hint of annoyance clear for both to hear. "Aunt Hestia. Fancy seeing you here. What brings you to this part of the city?" Artemis stammered out. Hestia's face didn't change but did turn to Athena rather than Artemis. "I know you are not going to pretend to be stupid. I know how beneath you that is, niece." She felt the goddess of the moon deflate in her grasp at her words. "You both know you're not supposed to be anywhere near the fox's den. If Zeus catches wind that you're here, there will be trouble. I don't particularly want a thunderstorm hovering over the city. Not when I'm about to walk home with the children." Their father was constantly reminding everyone of the rule in recent memory. It wasn't just Athena and Artemis that tried to sneak a peek, but the others Olympians too, with Apollo and Aphrodite being the two biggest culprits. The god of the sun tried to sneak in the early morning in disguise, covered head to toe in clothing he'd never be seen in that covered up his dashingly handsome good looks and masking his godly energy. Twice this year Zeus came down from Olympus, grabbed his son by the scruff of his neck and dragged him back home. Apollo would end up grounded for a month, only allowed out to drive the sun chariot across the sky. Aphrodite, on the other hand, had been trying to sneak into his home, morphing into a dove and sprawling herself out across his bed in not-so-subtle lingerie, hoping to seduce the hunka blonde into her awaiting arms. Instead, all she found was the goddess of the hearth waiting for her, grabbing her by the ear and dragging her back to Olympus. The goddess of love was persistent in her attempt to try and seduce Naruto. "I know, but the only reason I'm here is to stop Artemis from breaking the rules. The rules don't state we can't watch from a distance." Athena replied, trying to hold her ground against her aunt but feeling herself wither at the glance she got back. "We're not technically doing anything wrong. I think we both know that's pushing it." Hestia snapped her fingers. Artemis and Athena both felt their forms shift and return to their normal states. "I suppose I should be impressed you managed to last this long, unlike your brother and Aphrodite." The glow around Hestia vanished. "Don't lump us in with those buffoons," Artemis muttered. Gods, she didn't want to be compared to those pair of airheads. Hestia shook her head and rubbed her forehead. "Go home, both of you. I don't like splitting my essence like this when I'm meant to be watching over the children." Thalia and, a look of distaste washed over Athena's face, "Poseidon's boy. I'm still surprised that child and his mother ended up in Naruto's care. It's almost as if the fates are trying to align the paths of the children of the big three to him. Well, if there's anything I've learned since knowing Naruto, it's that he has a habit of attracting people from all walks of life. Both have flourished with him around and taking an active role in their lives." Hestia moved towards her nieces and looked down at the shop below them. "He's started teaching Thalia to bake, you know. She's quite good at it. We both think she has a knack for it. The daughter of Zeus has a preference for cupcakes with lots of icing. They had to be careful they didn't let her eat too many. Otherwise, the girl would find herself bouncing from wall to wall with the electricity across the block going crazy. The last time she had a sugar rush, all the electrical appliances in their home and the next two homes blew up. That's nice and everything, but I think there's a conversation we haven't had since news of Poseidon's son became public to Olympus." Athena crossed her arms and hardened the look in her eyes. "Is it wise for Thalia Grace and Percy Jackson to be allowed to remain so close to each other when their scent alone attracts the biggest and most dangerous monsters that plague our children and descendants? I have yet to see Naruto's skills in actions and have yet to see how he would handle such a foe." Hestia remained tight-lipped about the capabilities of the blonde. Neither could get their aunt to answer many of their questions, nor the other gods for that matter. Both of them, as warrior deities, wanted to know how well he could handle himself. To be able to put himself between their father and their uncle and walk away alive was a feat in itself. What they had managed to piece together was the fighting capabilities of the Old Ones. The men of gold that reigned during the era of the Titans were far greater than that of mortal in this day and age, with powers and skills that few could dream of. It would be like something out of a fable or comic book. But he was a man of gold like no other. Someone Gaia herself visited to aid the Titans in defeating the Olympians during their rise to power. They knew he was strong, but how strong? Both wanted to learn that answer. None more so than Athena, who hated seeing a puzzle she couldn't solve. To their surprise, Hestia merely smiles and let out a low chuckle. Trust me when I saw this, sweet niece. There is no one on this planet more capable of fending off the monsters that plague the children of the gods than the man currently teaching Sally Jackson the correct way to make triple berry Nutella cupcakes. Hestia informed. Naruto was an iron wall between Thalia and Percy and the monsters that might try to harm them. They wouldn't be able to go over, beneath, around, or through said wall. They would merely be blocked every time and sent to their doom for trying to reach the children. He was a protector. A guardian. How sure are you? I'd bet my essence on it. Every last drop of it. The statement was enough to make the sisters look at one another. Now, go on. Hestia made a little shoe notion with her hand. I'll keep this little visit our secret, but next time I will inform Zeus. Rules are here for a reason, and I won't always bend them for you. Leave it be. Giving one last smile, Hestia warped away in a swirl of fire, leaving the sisters alone on the rooftop to ponder everything she had said. It was the elder of the two who acted first. Come on. Athena huffed, grabbing her sister by the sleeve of her shirt. Let's go before Hestia makes good on her promise. I don't feel like getting confined to my temple anytime soon. Fine. Artemis groaned but followed along. Do you think we can convince Hera to make us her famous shepherd's pie? At the same time as the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of the moon were making their way back to Olympus, a very different immortal also found themselves in New York City, though this one was visiting for a different reason. Knowing New York was technically under the jurisdiction of the Olympian pantheon, he didn't appear to care as he teleported his way to Midgard and threw himself into their backyard. He wasn't afraid of any Olympian, but he ensured his arrival was subtle, lest he wanted to face the wrath of his father and mother. They were far more frightening than some puny god like Zeus or Ares. Ha! Their arms were twigs in comparison to his own. A deep, bellyful laugh broke the calm silence as men and women peacefully going about their afternoon through Central Park were caught unaware. All stopped and couldn't help but marvel at the sight they were seeing in front of them. Come on, one more. No, 5 more. Better yet. 10 more. Let me show you my great strength. A pair of large and meaty hands ushered a woman forward, soon followed by a squeal as he hoisted her up and placed her on his wide and powerful shoulders. I'm sure I came here for a reason, but I'm having such fun with you, young mortals. Some laughed at the exuberance that vibrated from the man, while others looked at him as if he wasn't human. Was he one of those strong men that competed in lifting competitions? It would explain the physical strength he was displaying to everyone. He had the body for it, with arms like tree trunks and standing somewhere around 6.5 feet tall. 4 women sat on his enormous shoulders, 2 on each side with his arms extended out. It looked as if he wasn't even trying, and all 4 girls looked as if they were having the time of their lives, with one being so bold to run her hand beneath his vest. There wasn't even sweat on his brow. His shoulder-length red hair wasn't even sticking to his skin. You Midgardians are so light. It's like I'm lifting little more than feathers. He tried to usher another woman over, claiming he could fit another one on those wide shoulders of his, but none dared to step forward. There are none who can match my strength throughout the 9 realms. Just who in the world was this guy? A few more minutes passed before the jovial man appeared to have enough as a look of recollection appeared on his face. Letting the 4 women of his shoulders, he gave one last laugh and eyebrow wiggle before a determined look was on his face. He swept his hand through his long hair before asking, I'm looking for a place known as the West Village. I'm in search of a man who runs a shop of sorts. He calls it the Fox's Den. He fumbled around in his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. A crude drawing of a blond man with whiskers was on full display, though it looked as if it was drawn by an 8-year-old, rather than a grown man. he looks like this." Everyone looked at him funny as they stared at the drawing, though none dared to voice a joke about the man's lack of drawing talent. By chance, one of the girls that were on his shoulder had visited that very afternoon and was good enough to point him in the right direction. "You're sure?" "Yeah, I'm pretty sure. That's the guy behind the counter." The red-haired man gave a loud laugh and surprised the woman by planted a big kiss on her lips, leaving the woman swooning and baffled at the same time. He was overjoyed and didn't remain for much longer before everyone watched as he took off at speeds that should have been possible for one as large as himself. The last thing any of them saw was the man reached for his waist and pulling up a hammer with a large trapezoidal-shaped iron slab. He waved it in the air as he pursued his target. Naruto tapped his chin as he inspected the cupcake, taking everything in over its form, smell, and taste. Smell. Check. The wave of chocolate wafting around his nose was perfect. Not too overpowering, nor was it too sickly. The ratio was just right. Texture? Check. Nice and fluffy, just how they were meant to be. It didn't want to fall apart with the slightest bit of pressure and wasn't too hard that it became uncomfortable to eat. The most important part, though, was the taste. Everything rode on how well the cupcake tasted in his mouth. The last batch Sally made was passable, but that wasn't enough to serve their loyal customers. A standard was set by the blonde, and later on, Hestia when she officially joined them. Some could say it wasn't fair to put such pressure on Sally's shoulders, but it wasn't like they were asking her to master a dozen recipes in a short time frame. Sally had asked for them to teach her a thing or two about bucking, and by Olympus, they would do just that. Speaking of said woman, she stood a few feet to the side, ignoring the clones at work around her and gazing nervously at her boss. If she was to work at the Fox's Den, then Naruto had to warn her about some of the strange things she would see. It wasn't every day a mortal, even a clear-sighted mortal like Sally, came across a dozen or so carbon copies of the man who employed her, working around the kitchen. To her credit, she took it on the chin and fell right into the craziness, as if she belonged there from the very start. One of her hands gently pulled on her sleeve, trying to take a calming breath as the blonde lifted one of the cupcakes up to his mouth and took a bite out of it. She tried not to look too visibly nervous, but she didn't want to let Naruto nor Hestia down. Both had shown her on multiple occasions how to make the cupcakes and felt she was getting closer and closer to perfecting them. Was it strange that she wanted to make them proud? She didn't think so. They'd done so much for her that she wanted to show them every day that their time and effort had been for nothing. She heard him say aloud, licking his lips as he tried to gather up any loose crumbs, "I gotta say, Sally," he turned and looked at her and smiled, "they're perfect." Sally's eyes lit up, "Really? They are?" "Yep. I can't taste a single fault with them. If I didn't know any better, I'd say Hestia or myself made these." Rubbing his hands together, he took a step forward and rested a hand on Sally's head. "Good job, Sally. I'm proud of you." You are?" the former lover of Poseidon asked, doing her best not to get misty-eyed at the compliment sent her way. "Of course. Whatever Hestia, myself or the world for that matter has thrown at you, you've adapted and worked hard. You never stop trying to better yourself, and it shows in the food you make." He picked up the tray with the rest of the cupcakes and handed them back to Sally, who grasped at the edges eagerly. "I think these deserve to go in the cabinet, and make sure you tell people who made them. I'm sure they would all be very pleased to eat anything made by your hands." Sally was very well loved by the regulars who dined at the Fox's Den. For many of them, they'd watched Sally prosper into the confident young woman she was today. Even better for Naruto, who got to watch her blossom as an incredible mother to young Percy. He'd been there in the waiting room at the hospital when she was giving birth to the son of Poseidon. According to Hestia, Sally kicked childbirth's ass. All 19 hours of it. He still didn't understand how women did it all these years later. Kudos to them. Minutes later, the back door that led to the alleyway swung open, with Naruto walking out with a trash bag gripped in one hand. Whistling a jaunty little tune with a slight skip in his step, he moved to the nearby bin and threw the bag inside. "I wonder what Hestia's making Percy and Thalia for dinner tonight. I know Thalia has her hopes on burgers, but I doubt she'd make them 2 nights in a row." He laughed, imagining a patient-looking Hestia with her arms crossed as Thalia stomped unhappily in front of her, her fingers in her ears and trying to hold her breath. The daughter of Zeus had certainly inherited her father's stubbornness and often tried to get her own way by acting out, but Hestia was no stranger to such dramatics. If she could handle one such as Zeus, she could handle a young girl. He didn't know what the record was, but Hestia was overwhelmingly in the lead, whilst Thalia only had a victory or two over the past 4 years. Ha! Found you! Blinking in surprise, Naruto had little time to react as he jumped high in the air, using his chakra to stick to a nearby wall as a large object flew past the spot he was previously standing. Turning his head to the entrance of the alleyway, he fought back a groan when he spotted a familiar deity blocking the way, his hand outstretched. Thor! What are you doing here? A jovial laugh escaped the god of thunder as his hammer, Mjolnir, flew back into his hand in the blink of an eye. A grin was plastered on his face and swept his long red hair back as his intense blue eyes stared down the blonde with unfavoured glee. My old friend! I've spent the better part of a month trying to track you down until I finally got the word you were in this city. He swung his hammer in the air, his smile turning into a grin. I've come to challenge you. It's been centuries since we last fought. Let us shake the heavens with our fists one more time. Naruto wanted to groan, we are not fighting in the middle of New York. The answer he got was another laugh from the god of thunder and watched as he jumped high in the air with his hammer held high. He meant to crush it into the blonde's skull but instead found himself getting drop-kicked square in the chest and forced higher into the air. In the blink of an eye, Naruto landed and pushed himself back into the air and grabbed Thor before his body could exit the alleyway. When they landed, Naruto didn't give Thor a chance to act and promptly dragged him over to the nearby trash can and threw him inside. He threw the lid down with a loud resounding echo and flashed away with the bin and Thor in tow. A bitter chill ran across his face as he landed on the steep mountainside of the Matterhorn in Switzerland. This would do for the time being. As I said, you idiot. We're not fighting. I like New York. I'm not leveling another city with you. He blinked away, leaving the god of thunder groaning inside the bin as he tried to gather his bearings. Naruto flashed back again, twice. We did that twice. He flashed away again, returning to the fox's den to hurry his customers home and abruptly close his business for the evening. This was not how his day was meant to end. Chapter 19, Part 19. Lifting the ladle from the pot, Hestia brought it halfway to her lips when she stopped as a flash of yellow appeared out of the corner of her eye. After years of seeing the technique used, she recognized the user instantly, though was understandably confused why he was home so early. Turning to face him, she found he wasn't alone with Sally stood by his side along with Melino, though the mortal woman looked visibly confused as well as her niece. Her blonde bestie, however, looked visibly irritated. What's going on? It's far too early for you to be home. She asked, what about the customers? I'm equally as confused, Sally admitted. 1 minute I'm serving customers, and the next thing I know, Naruto is ushering them out of the building and locking all the doors. It was all very sudden. He hasn't told me what's going on. I wouldn't mind an answer myself. You made me spill coffee down the front of my apron. She motioned to her apron with her hand rather dramatically. None of their questions got answered right away, though the three curiously followed him as he peeked his head into the living room. Inside, Thalia and Percy were present, with Percy drawing a blue dinosaur while Thalia watched television. That was good. Naruto, what's going on? The blonde shinobi turned to look at Hestia. You haven't felt a new power signature arrive in New York recently? He looked at Melino and asked the same question. Melino shook her head, and Hestia replied with a resounding, no. Nothing out of the ordinary. Beneath his breath, they heard him curse. Damn. He's gotten better at hiding his energy. Who has? Naruto sighed and looked at Hestia. Thor is in New York. He stopped by the fox's den about 10 minutes ago, but I managed to throw him in a trash can and teleport him to Switzerland. It should get him out of our hair for a little while. Hearing the god of thunder's name, Hestia's eyes initially widened before her face dropped and a rare scowl appeared. Oh joy. Back up a moment. Melino put her hands up, a look of panic on her face. What do you mean Thor's in New York? I thought gods from other pantheons weren't meant to trespass on each other's turf. The last thing Maino wanted to witness was the famed god of thunder duking it out with gods of her pantheon. Why is he here? And you put him in a bin? In Switzerland. I have an idea why he's here. The tone of disapproval was evident in Hestia's voice. So much so she almost sounded like Hera. He's here because he wants a fight, doesn't he? Naruto nodded and sighed, yeah. The next thing he knew, he felt Hestia slapping his arm repeatedly. Ow. Quit it. I told you centuries ago it was a bad idea to let Thor goad you into a fight, but you had to let him get under your skin. It went on for a few more seconds before Hestia relented, though her stern expression didn't leave. Does he know this address? I don't think so. To be honest, I was more focused on getting him out of the city than asking 20 questions. Thor isn't the subtle kind, and I don't need your brother or any of the others knowing he's in the city without the permission of Olympus. Hold on. Hold on. The three immortals turned and looked towards Sally, whose arms were in the air, a look of panic and disbelief written all over her face. Thor? As in the Norse god of thunder? Son of Odin and Frigga. An Aesir god. Do you know anyone else by that name? Melino asked, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. But they're real too. I thought it was only the Greeks that were real. The goddess of ghosts turned her head to look at the older pair with an eyebrow raised. You never told her about the other pantheons. We may have skipped over a few details, Naruto admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. It was a conversation we were going to have for a later date, Hestia revealed. Given New York is under Olympian jurisdiction, the gods from other pantheons have to inform us when they'll be stopping by. It doesn't happen often, so we didn't see the need for that topic to be brought up yet. Then again, we didn't take Thor's idiocy into account. Do you know him well? Melino asked, but quickly went silent at the irritated aura she could feel around her. It didn't look like the goddess of the hearth was the biggest fan of the Norse god of thunder. And Hestia. They all heard and watched as Thalia appeared through the doorway. The 9-year-old stopped and stared at the 4 adults huddled together in the hallway. Huh? Uncle, when did you get back? I didn't hear you get home. The TV remote was still in her hand, and behind her, Percy followed after his cousin. A big smile lit his face when he spotted Sally and was quickly moved around the older demigod and clutched his mother's legs. Hi, Mama. Sally smiled, picking him up and placing him on her hip. Hello, Percy. Her face looked a little pale. She tried not to give away that anything was wrong and put on a brave face for the kids. We just got back, Naruto replied to Thalia's question. Is something the matter? There's some weird guy outside running up and down the street waving a hammer around, Thalia revealed, making the 4 adults look at each other. He keeps shouting to come out and fight. Who do you think he's talking to? Oh, boy, Naruto muttered before he and the girls all made their way to the window and looked outside to the front of the street. Just as Thalia said, there was Thor in the middle of the street. The god of thunder was looking a little grubbier than usual, likely on account of being shoved in a bin and left on a mountain in Switzerland, and didn't appear happy that Naruto had duped him. Come out and face me. Face the might of thunder. He bellowed. People walking past hurried past the scene as quickly as they could. Cars passing nearby slowed down to get a view of his wild actions, though one found themselves an unlucky victim of Thor as the red-haired god climbed atop and stood on the bonnet of the vehicle. Let us duel to Helheim and back. That's Thor? Sally asked, staring intently at the man. Naruto sighed, yeah, that's him. I always pictured someone, blonder. She tilted her head, though, physically, he's everything else I imagined. He's as big as Poseidon. Melino hummed with a hint of disapproval. I can't say I've ever met the guy before, but he acts as exactly how my father described him. Hades met him centuries ago, though I don't think Thor left a good impression on him. Then again, who does when it comes to my father? There was a scream outside, and everyone winced as Thor lifted his hammer and tapped the bonnet of the car with his hammer. The effect was instant, with the front half of the car suddenly buckling under the force behind it and became little more than a crushed piece of debris pancaked on the road. The driver said nothing except scream as he stumbled out of the car and ran in the other direction. Oh, geez. Naruto ran a hand over his face, annoyance growing as the god of thunder continued making a scene. The last thing they needed was someone calling the police. That would make matters far worse. I should probably go out and sort this out. Even if this going to be a real pain in my ass. He turned away from the window before voicing his surprise when he noticed someone was missing, Hestia. Melino and Sally both looked at where the goddess of the hearth had been standing moments ago before everyone heard the front door open. The three of them turned back to the window and watched as the eldest member of the Olympian family descended the steps and made her way over to Thor. The blonde couldn't see her face, but judging by the way she was walking, almost like a female Terminator zeroing on their target, she wasn't happy. Eventually, they all saw Thor turn in her direction, and the man had the decency to stop his destruction and appear pleased by her presence. He threw his arms in the air and jumped beside her. However, before he could say a word, Naruto, Melino, and Sally all winced as the right hand of Hestia lit up in fire and slapped the larger immortal in the cheek. The connection of palm to face was loud, and the god of thunder had the decency to stumble back a step before finding Hestia's hand locked around his ear and dragged back to the house. Ouch. That hot a sting. Melino muttered, looking in disbelief that the kind and sweet Hestia had it in her to slap someone like Thor. Who knew she had it in her? Unhand me. Goddess of the hearth you may be, but I am the mighty Thor. Oh, shut up, you buffoon. Before you cause any more damage. Footsteps reappeared in the hallway as the front door closed. The voices drew the attention of the two demigods, who turned and looked at the hallway. Thalia made to head out and find out what was going on, but instead found herself being lifted by Naruto by the scruff of her neck and deposited back onto the couch. Hey. Stay here, Thalia. Aunt Hestia and I need to have words with an old friend of ours. Closing the door behind them, he made a beeline for the kitchen and was treated to the sight of Hestia still with her hand locked around the god of thunder's ear and pushing him into a chair. Unhand me, woman. One does not pinch the ear of the son of Odin, lest they wish to feel my wrath. When the blonde walked into the kitchen, the Aesir's annoyance appeared to leave him, excitement washing over his face. My friend. That was a sneaky trick you pulled, but dropping me on a mountain is not something I haven't survived before. Come, let us battle. Though he tried to stand up, the larger man found himself releasing a high-pitched squeal as Hestia twisted his ear in a position it wasn't meant to go. What did I just tell you? Hestia barked back. It was uncommon to see Hestia get riled up, but Thor had a knack of doing so to calmer immortals. Naruto sighed, rubbing his forehead with his palm. Look, Thor. It's good to see you, but I'm not fighting you. New York isn't exactly a place built for a battle like ours. A bit of warning would have been nice too that you were coming. But my friend. Our battles are legendary. When our fists collide, the very foundations of the 9 realms shake in anticipation. You can't tell me you don't wish to feel that again. Naruto made a face and shook his head. Sorry, but I'm not interested. I only fight when I have to. Not to satisfy the whims of a god who constantly loses his hammer, which also happens to be one of the most powerful weapons in all creation. Like a child, Thor let out a whine and blew a raspberry. You're no fun. I came all this way expecting you to indulge me. This is incredibly disappointing. Thor crossed his arms and winced as the tightness around his ear remained. Please let go of my ear. He turned and looked up at the goddess. I'll behave. There was a glumness to his voice. Do you promise not to cause total mayhem and not pick a fight? Yes, I promise. The hand left his ear, and he brought his own up to gentle soothe it. I really can't tempt you in a bout of fisticuffs. Nope, tough luck. Go pick a fight with a giant, or something. We both know they're not nearly as fun. Then go pick a fight with a fire giant. Those guys are always looking for a good fight. That's right up your alley. Bah. This is the god of thunder. Sally asked, leaning over and whispering in Melino's ear. He's not exactly what I pictured. Are all gods from the Norse pantheon so idiotic? Whose knows? We mostly keep to ourselves. Gods don't normally mingle with other pantheons unless it's strictly business. She looked at Thor and watched in distaste as he picked something out of his ear. This one though, he's an idiot of the highest order, Melino replied, appearing less than impressed at the Norse god. Her father's description of the man was on point. No wonder he didn't have a good thing to say about him. Hearing their voices, Thor looked past Naruto and Hestia and found the younger goddess and the mortal woman staring at him. His eyebrows shot up and Naruto and Hestia watched as he hung his hammer back on his waist and stepped forward. Sally barely had a moment to react before she found herself under Thor's gaze, the god towering over her and placing his arm above her as he leaned on the wall. A tiny smirk was on his face. "So, tell me, mortal. Aside from being drop-dead gorgeous, what do you do for a living? And do you by chance like the gun show?" The muscles in his arms flexed, showing off his powerful arms. "How about we get out of here, and I'll show you how the god of thunder treats a woman." "Oh, gods." Melino wanted to gag, and the expressions on Naruto and Hestia's faces weren't any better. Sally didn't appear to know what to do with her face flushed from his comments and found herself stepping back in surprise as the goddess of ghosts got between them. "Back off. She's not interested, spark plug, dot. Who are you?" He looked Melino up and down. "I don't recognize you though you smell of the underworld." He rubbed his chin. "Someone connected to that old fart, Hades, I assume? You're as pale as he is, though you're much better looking." He shrugged, before saying, "I suppose you can come too. I have energy plenty for both of you dash." Behind him, a hand wrapped in flames grabbed his ear and yanked him away and made the god of thunder bellow in agony as he was forced back into the chair. Hestia stood behind him, looking positively wrathful at the comments he made to the point where Naruto had to stand behind her and keep her from melting Thor's face off. "You really can't help putting your foot in your mouth, can you?" Naruto muttered, "They're not interested, so don't flirt with them." That was also the cheesiest pickup line I've heard in years. I think every love goddess in existence would be hunched over in agony. "I thought it was pretty good," Thor whined. It took a minute for Naruto to calm Hestia down before she finally let go of Thor, though the man's ear was red all over with burns. "Your grip is still like an iron claw after all these centuries, Hestia. Would you smile if I said it was good to see you?" "No." "Oh. Well, no matter." He turned and looked at Naruto. "So, really no battle?" Naruto shook his head, "Afraid not." Thor visibly deflated but ended up shrugging his shoulder. "Oh, well. Maybe in another century." Thor stood up back up, idly keeping watch of Hestia to ensure she didn't grab him by the ear again. He extended his hand towards the blonde, and after a moment of hesitation, Naruto shook it. "It's been a long time, my friend." "It has. You haven't visited Asgard or Vanaheim in centuries. I know many in my pantheon would love to see you again." Thor nudged his elbow into the blonde. "Lady Freya always asks for you. She says she misses your presence in her halls." "I'm sure she does." Naruto rolled his eyes and caught Melino looking at him. "What? You've been to Asgard and Vanaheim?" she asked, looking visibly surprised at this new piece of information. "And you know Freya? When were you going to share that with the rest of the class?" Naruto shrugged. "Now, I guess." Honestly, he hadn't thought to mention it. The two pantheons tended to stay out of each other's way, although he heard a few confrontations and interactions occurred over the years. The only Greek god who had any interaction with them was Hestia, and that was through him. "I lived there for a century. Vanaheim, I mean, but I visited Asgard on occasion." Melino let her jaw drop while turning to look at Sally. "This guy. Can you believe him?" Sally didn't appear to be baffled by the revelation. "I mean, is it that surprising?" She looked at the blonde. "Vanaheim is the Vanir version of heaven, right?" She didn't know much about Norse mythology, but she knew some things. Deciding to learn all she could about the Greek pantheon after finding out one of its gods knocked her up, she dove deep into the lore surrounding them. Sometimes her mind wandered and she wondered if any of the other pantheons existed too. It appears she was correct. "What's Freya like?" "Freya? She's nice enough. We got on well, though she wasn't very pleased when I chose to leave and return to Earth." Naruto scratched the back of his head. "I haven't really heard much from her since then. Freya can be quite petty. She reminds me of your love goddess, whom I've never had the pleasure of meeting. She doesn't take people rejecting her very well." Thor added. "At least, she's not as persistent as Aphrodite is," Hestia muttered from Naruto's side. Honestly, the Olympian goddess of love didn't understand the concept of being rejected. Yeah, tell me about it. He was thankful he hadn't had a run-in with the love goddess since the Pantheon got barred from visiting. He was well aware of her sneaking into his home and his bedroom, but Hestia dealt with her accordingly. Since you're here, do me a favor and don't destroy anything. Do you not trust me, my old friend? Is that a serious question? Before Thor could answer, the door to the kitchen swung open, with Thalia walking inside to join the rest of the adults. The little girl was rather confused with everything that was going on. She could hear raised voices coming from the kitchen and decided to investigate. Uncle? Auntie? What's going on? She asked and found herself staring up at the large red-haired man who'd been shouting fighting words in the street. Thalia had never seen someone so massive before. He was even bigger than her uncle. The god of thunder's attention turned from the adult to the young girl and started smelling the air. A scent he was familiar with floated through the air, one he recognized as the scent of the ozone. He'd smelled it faintly when he got dragged into the house by Hestia, but it was overwhelming when the girl appeared, attacking his sense of smell. So, she was the source of it. He pointed towards Thalia in a rather dramatic Phocian, a child of Zeus. He looked over at Naruto again. Are you taking in more strays, my friend? Don't call her a stray. Don't forget, the last demigod I took care of was your daughter. And I am forever grateful. He sniffed the air and looked at the stove. Do I smell food? Are you cooking? Naruto sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. No, that's Hestia who's cooking tonight. He gave Thor a look. Why? All Thor did was give a slightly pleading look and patted his stomach. He hadn't eaten since that morning and was overdue for his next meal. He didn't feel like waiting until he returned to Asgard, and plead with his darling wife, Sif, to cook him up something. Hestia and Naruto turned to look at each other. Naruto held up his hands and shrugged, trying to ask the goddess of the hearth to be reasonable. Her dislike of the god of thunder was evident for all to sense, even for said deity. The staring contest went on for a few moments, with Hestia trying desperately to convey how unhappy she was with the idea of Thor staying for dinner. Eventually, her shoulders slumped, and she released a huff. Fine, but only for tonight. You leave as soon as your plate is clean. Thor let out a chant of success while Naruto put his arm around his best friend's shoulder. It's just one evening. Hestia pouted, putting her hands on her hips. It's better be. At the same time the Norse god of thunder was visiting the Uzumaki home. Another had followed her father as he trekked through the 9 worlds, using the world tree, and narrowly avoided the overgrown squirrel that took up residence along its branches, and landed in Central Park just as Thor had earlier that day. This world has changed much since I was last here. The figure was female, though she stood out compared to the Midgardian women who walked past her, looking up and down her form. It was as if they'd never seen a Valkyrie before. Standing 6 foot in height with pale silver blonde hair tied in a braid, the young woman looked no older than 18, though her eyes and the way she carried herself spoke of a person far older than she appeared. A leather set of Valkyrie armor adorned her body, though she visibly looked uncomfortable wearing it as a sheen of sweat quickly covered her brow as the June sun shined down on her. A golden necklace with a hammer emblem sat comfortably around her neck, and strapped to her back was an extendable spear and a shield. Her pale blue eyes looked around the area. She didn't remember such large buildings existed in Midgard. They were almost as high as the clouds, though her gaze did rest on the Empire State Building that stood off in the distance. She could feel the thrum of power that came from the Olympian pantheon, making the girl somewhat uncomfortable at being so close to a pantheon that wasn't her own. Mixing with other pantheons wasn't encouraged, though sometimes it was known to happen. None sought out these instances more like her foolish father, who loved nothing more than to poke and prod the other gods when he got bored. Sometimes she wondered if fighting was his true love and not the goddess of war that awaited him back home on Asgard. Her father sometimes infuriated her, but she could say confidently she knew him like the back of his hand. There is only one man father would have sought out for a fight after all this time. She muttered to herself, groaning as the image of Thor getting chucked around by a familiar blonde appeared in her mind. Her father was not the only reason she was in Midgard, though. There was another reason she was in New York, and it required the man that raised her all the same. You there? Answer thy question. Grabbing a nearby mortal, she held the unsuspecting man by the collar of his shirt, his eyes going wide as he was held by the large blonde woman. Yes. I'm looking for an establishment known as the Fox's Den. It's run by a man known as Naruto Uzumaki. Give me its location, or feel the wrath of the daughter of Thor. She tightened her grip on the Anne's collar. The man blinked and looked at her funny. The Fox's Den? I think that's a place in the West Village. Which way is the West Village? And why there is a village in the heart of a city? That seems counterproductive for all you've built here. He looked at her funny. It's not an actual village. Are you an idiot? The next thing the man knew, he was finding himself getting thrown into the air and dangling from a tree, flailing around as his pants got caught on one of the branches. You there? Where is the West Village? And have you heard of a man known as Naruto Uzumaki? This series of questioning went on for a good 5 minutes, with more people, men and women, finding themselves thrown into trees or a nearby bush when they questioned the blonde woman's intelligence. One girl even made fun of what she was wearing and soon found her very lacy thong pulled so high in the air she started seeing stars. Mortals are useless. The girl commented with a huff. I know where you can find Naruto Uzumaki. Turning around at the voice, her eyes widened as the most beautiful woman she'd ever seen looked back at her. Her blonde hair fell past her shoulder blades and hauntingly beautiful green eyes one could get lost in. She was dressed for the weather in a frilly pink summer dress that stopped just above the knees and a pair of high heels that looked impossible to walk in. Her smile was coy and spoke of giddy mischief. With her heels on, she was the same height as the daughter of Thor. Gunala stopped and stared at the beautiful woman. She could sense the divine energy rolling off her body. The smell of fresh jasmine was all around her. She couldn't help but swallow thickly. She was mesmerizing to look at. She could have sworn her appearance would shift with each blink, and long tresses of black hair and emerald green eyes would flicker into being. Remembering where she was, she approached cautiously. You are an Olympian, aren't you? Of the Greek pantheon. The woman smiled and held out her hand, showing her knuckles. The goddess of love, Aphrodite. What's your name, young Valkyrie? Gunala. Trepidatiously, Gunala took Aphrodite's hand and kissed the knuckles, getting a widened smile from her. You said you know where Naruto is. I do. I believe I saw him entertaining your father, Thor. At least, that's who I believe he is. The scent of ozone lingers around him much in the way it does around Zeus. The woman walked around Gunala, her shoes clinking as she moved. You have the same scent, though it's not as potent. It was very bold of you to come here when you haven't gained our permission. Then again, your father did the same. Gunala grimaced. My father does not always think things through and does things on a whim most days. However, I'm here on behalf of Lord Odin to ensure my father doesn't cause trouble and to meet with Naruto Uzumaki. Might ask why? I'm rather fond of him, even though he's managed to avoid me these last few years. I'm not at liberty to say anything. Oh? You won't even tell little ol' me? Aphrodite fluttered her eyelashes, and Gunala felt her willpower take a hit. Swallowing thickly one more time, she crossed her arms and held her own. Even you. I can be very persuasive. Aphrodite looked Gunala up and down again. I've never been with a Valkyrie before. I can't help but wonder. Gunala didn't say anything. Half expecting to be blown away by the Olympian, she was surprised to find the goddess shrugging her shoulders with her smile still present on her face. Very well. I'll only find out in due time. Elegantly spinning on the thin tip of her heels, Aphrodite skipped off, ignoring the looks of hopeless dedication rolling off the mortals she moved past. Come along, young Valkyrie. I'll show you the way. Gunala didn't need to be told twice and quickly followed after the goddess of love, hoping no one else from the Greek pantheon showed up and caused a problem. Then again, she couldn't help but feel uneasy being led away by the Aphrodite. She knew the stories that floated around the beautiful deity and knew what a tricky individual she could be when things didn't go her way. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of connection she had to her blonde target. Haha. She's so tiny. Are you sure she's a daughter of Zeus? Thor asked, looking jovial, as he held Thalia in his hands and dangled her in the air. Said girl was looking unimpressed, her arms folded and cheeks puffed out. She has his eyes, I suppose, but does she have his right hook? He put her down on the ground and crouched in front of her. Punch me right here, little one. That appeared to get Thalia's interest as her earlier disapproval disappeared. Okay. She clenched her fist and readied to land a punch on the awaiting deity. There will be no violence in this house, thank you very much. Hestia admonished, guiding her niece away from Thor and leading her to her seat around the table. Dinner was being served up, and the god of thunder had invited himself for dinner. Go sit down in your usual place. I'll be serving up food in a moment. Okay, Aunt Hestia. The daughter of Zeus marched to the table like a good girl while Hestia directed a huff Thor's way. You've been here all of 5 minutes. Behave, or you'll be out. She reaffirmed. Just because Naruto was okay with Thor being here, that didn't mean she was. Oh, she and the god of thunder had met numerous times, and each time she was reaffirmed why they were like oil and water. Throughout the millennia, the duo of herself and Naruto would constantly get interrupted by a small number of deities who were aware of the blonde's existence, but none more so than Thor. They were the polar opposite of each other. She was quiet. He was loud. She was gentle and patient. He was violent and brutish. He reminded her too much of Ares. Ares was her nephew, therefore she had some amount of love for him. Thor, on the other hand, was a member of another pantheon who seemed to enjoy getting on her nerves. Wherever he appeared, he caused a mess and didn't appear to care about the consequences. Hestia didn't openly hate anyone, barring her own father, but she could say with confidence she didn't really like Thor either. Tolerate was likely the best way she could describe it. She tolerated him because, for some reason, Naruto was friends with the man and enjoyed his company when he wasn't trying to swing a hammer into his skull. Go take a seat around the table, Hestia told him. A ladle appeared in her hand and pointed at him, but one whiff of trouble, and you're out. Gods. She sounded like Hera. For once, Thor had the sense not to say anything stupid and merely gave a salute as he wandered into the dining room. Sally and Percy were already in the room, with the said boy taking a keen interest in the large man he'd never seen before. He gave the god of thunder a small wave. Hello. In response, Thor waved back similarly. Hello, tiny human. I'm Percy. Who are you? I'm Thor, god of thunder. He pulled out Mjolnir and showed it to the son of Poseidon, and this is Mjolnir. One of the mightiest weapons in the known universe. He grinned, giving it a quick spin and feeling the air push against his skin. I have killed many monsters with my hammer. Some as large as mountains. Percy looked up at him in awe. Whoa. He reached his hands out. Can I hold? Of course, Thor started to say before feeling two sets of eyes bearing into his skull. Sally and Melino looked at him as if telling him to think twice and choose a different answer. The hammer was already halfway across the table when he pulled back. Perhaps when you're bigger. Nah. Percy pouted and stuck out his lower lip. Please. Percy Jackson. Sally said next to her son, looking at him with a stern expression, it would be much too heavy for you. No means no. As Sally spoke with her son, the god of thunder looked in Melino's direction but quickly turned away as the goddess of ghosts leveled him with a dark glare. Perhaps it was best not aggravate the daughter of Hades. Thor could have sworn there was a dark aura floating around her body, but he was sure that was a trick of the light. The chill running up his spine. Yeah, that was probably her. Feeling a tug on his shirt, he turned and looked down at the seat next to him. Thalia was next to him, her big blue eyes looking up at him full of curiosity. Yes. Do you know my dad? Thor made a small humming noise, of sorts. We've met a couple of times. What's he like? You've not met him. Thalia shook her head. Uncle and Auntie said there are rules that stop him from seeing me. I don't really get it. Thalia scrunched up her face. Does he not love me? Thor's mouth opened, yet no words came out. As much of a blockhead as he was, how in the world was he meant to answer that? It was like getting pushed between a giant and a hard place. What was he supposed to say? What was he meant to do? Naruto and Hestia were still in the kitchen while Sally was talking to her son. The daughter of Hades appeared to hear the question but was merely watching him in mild amusement. Her coal-like eyes sparkled in sick glee. Was she enjoying the fact he was squirming beneath the questioning gaze of this little girl? Like daughter, like father, I suppose. Trying to come up with an answer as quickly as possible, he let out an audible groan of relief when the sound of the doorbell rang through the house, distracting Thalia and making the girl hop out of her seat. She made a beeline through the dining room and ducked beneath Naruto's arms as she raced to answer the front door. She didn't appear fazed as she heard her aunt call her name as she reached for the door and swung it open. "Hello, Thalia," Naruto said with a hint of sternness in his tone as he came up behind her. His mouth opened, but before words could come out, a strangled noise appeared. "Aphrodite." The blonde-haired beauty gave him a dazzling smile. "Hello, you hunky man, you. Long time no see." She walked straight past Thalia, whose only thoughts was, who the heck is this lady? The sound of Aphrodite's heels clacked against the hallway, and Naruto soon found himself just inches from the divine goddess. "You look more delicious than the last time I saw you. Then again, I didn't think my window of opportunity with you was an eternity." Naturally, the blonde did the only thing he could think of in this situation and called out, "Hestia! Get out here!" "What?" he heard from the kitchen as Hestia's head appeared from around the corner. Her eyes zeroed in on the goddess of love. "Oh, for goodness sake! What is it with you all today?" Hestia stormed out of the kitchen, face showing how unamused she was as yet another deity visiting during dinner time. Aphrodite proved quick as she skirted around Naruto, using the blonde as a shield to avoid Hestia's hand as she released a Tinkerbell-like giggle. "Don't be like that, Hestia. I'm merely visiting," she replied, narrowly dodging one of Hestia's hands. "You've been keeping Naruto all to yourself for so long. I just wanted a little peace. That's all. You know as well as I do, that's not the kind of relationship we have." An uncommon growl escaped from Hestia. "Will you hold still? What's going on out here?" Melino's head popped around the corner. "Oh." She was soon followed by Thor, Sally, and Percy, who appeared from behind his mother's leg. "Oh my god, she's beautiful," Sally whispered and turned to Melino. "Is she "Yeah, that's Aphrodite, goddess of love and the most irritating woman in my overly large family." "Wow. I wouldn't compliment her too much. Her ego's big enough already." Sally couldn't help it, but when she looked at Aphrodite, her eyes kept flickering from blue to sea green. She wondered why that was. Even her hair was going back and forth between blonde and black. The god of thunder, to his credit, didn't linger on the Greek love goddess. His focus shifted when another figure appeared by the door. "Daughter, did you follow me all the way to Midgard?" Naruto's eyes widened as a familiar young woman came into view, awkwardly standing in the door. "Gunala. Hi, uncle." She gave a short wave as Naruto steadily made his over to her until he was a foot away from her. "Sorry to come on and dash." The blonde Valkyrie didn't get to finish her sentence as the shinobi brought her in for a tight hug, his arms resting around her shoulders. Very quickly, whatever awkwardness Gunala had vanished, and a beaming smile lit up her face. "You know you're welcome here anytime you like. You'll never get turned away." He gently cupped her face. "I haven't seen you in almost 50 years. You haven't aged a day." "I could say the same. It's one of the perks of being a Valkyrie and living at Hotel Valhalla. Aging isn't much of an issue." A downcast look appeared. "I'm sorry it's been so long since I last visited you. With my duties as the leader of the Valkyries, it doesn't leave me with much free time." The blonde shook his head. "That's okay. You're here now. That's what matters." He put his arm around her shoulder and led her forward. "Let me introduce you to everyone. You remember Hestia, right? For one as formidable in appearance as the daughter of Thor, it was a surprise for all to see her act in such a shy manner." "I do. It's nice to see you again after all this time, Lady Hestia." She gave a polite bow but was waved off by Hestia and once again embrace. "It's lovely to see you again, my dear." Hestia gently cupped her face. "It's nice to see you didn't inherit much from your oaf of a father in terms of appearance." Hestia's smile widened when she heard Thor grumble behind her. "You must stay for dinner. We're about to serve up." I would like that, thank you," she replied before Naruto introduced everyone else. "That's Melino, the daughter of Hades and Greek goddess of ghosts." Melino gave a nonchalant wave. "And that's Sally. The little boy next to her is her son, Percy." "It's nice to meet you," Sally greeted. Percy merely gave a small wave, poking his head out from behind Sally, acting all shy all of a sudden. Aphrodite, you already know, Naruto muttered and leaned in close to whisper, dare I ask how you met? I ran into her at the park of Central. She offered to show me the way here. Though, I did feel like she had an ulterior motive. She gave the love goddess a side glance, with the said woman being scolded by Hestia, who hadn't forgotten her fellow deity was there. She wants something from you. Naruto snorted, of sorts. He wasn't going into any detail before gently pulling Thalia to stand in front of him with his hands resting on her shoulders, and this is Thalia. She's been under my care for 5 years now. She and you have a lot in common. The daughter of Zeus didn't say anything. She merely looked up at the blonde girl with widened eyes, her expression showing off an odd look. Who was this girl? And how did she get so tall and strong? She looked like she could bench press a car. Thalia had never seen another girl look so tough. Gunala could feel Thalia's eyes resting on her and knelt on one knee, getting a good look at the girl. Her hands came up and surprised the younger demigod by taking her hands into her own. A kind expression, one she only displayed to those close to her got to see, took over on Gunala's face. When I was a little girl, Uncle looked after me just as he looked after you and showed me right from wrong. Thalia tilted her head to look up at Naruto before quickly returning to Gunala, really? Duh. Gunala gently squeezed her hands, are you happy here? This time it was Thalia who nodded, conviction written all over her face, Uncle is the best. Thalia looked up at Naruto again, who smiled back happily, if Uncle looked after both of us, does that make us sisters? Ah. The innocence of a child. Gunala laughed, as did some of the adults. Melino even let out a small ah sound, though, would readily deny it to anyone. In a way, I guess it does. I think I'd like that. I think I'd like that, too. She gave Thalia one last squeeze before standing back up. When Naruto looked at her, her expression changed again, this time into one more serious. I wish I could say I came here for personal reasons, but I'm afraid I'm here on business. Lord Odin has asked me to come and find you. Naruto blinked in surprise and felt the eyes of everyone else in the room on him. Find me? Why? We've run into a small problem. A problem on Jotunheim. Ah. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck, the problem being who I'm thinking of. She nodded, that's right. One of them is picking fights with the giants and running amok. Gunala explained, I tried to stop him myself, but he doesn't listen to me. Lord Odin tried to reason with him but was promptly ignored. Gunala pouted, he still just sees me as an annoying brat. Yeah, that sounds about right. You'd think after all these millennia, he'd have calmed down some of his more extreme tendencies. The blonde sighed, well, it's not really a question if I'm going or not. I'm the only one who can reason with him. I guess I'm heading to Jotunheim. That damn idiot. Whoa. Hold up. Melino replied, making everyone turn in her direction, what do you mean you're going to Jotunheim? And who's she talking about? What other kind of secrets was he keeping from them? Hestia smiled, I think I have an idea. She gave Naruto a knowing look. You're probably thinking right. Naruto chuckled, patting Thalia on the head as she said inquisitively up at him, to answer your question, Melino, I have these friends who originate from the old era just like myself. 9 of them, in fact, and each one is as quirky and bizarre as the next. It sounds like one of them is causing trouble, and that means I need to leave for a few days. That's it for part 9. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.